In this hands-on lab nugget, you and I are going to add and then subtract. We're going to add a read-only domain controller, obviously talking about why these are so great for us in certain environments, and then we'll practice removing a domain controller from a domain. Why might we use a read-only domain controller? Well, one reason might be we have this branch office out there, and we've got an employee in there, Todd, and Todd is pretty capable, but we don't trust him with a full read-write Active Directory copy out at the branch office. Also, it is a branch office with a really slow WAN link up to our headquarters, so we'd like to take some of the burden of authentication off of the HQ system and that slow WAN link and place it on this remote office. We'd love individuals to be able to authenticate out there at the branch against the read-only domain controller that exists out there. If you're in a good spot to, go ahead and fire up the hands-on lab right now and join me as we configure this read-only domain controller out at the branch. Notice in the hands-on lab we have DCNUG1 and the DCNUG2 machine. I want you to go ahead and click on DCNUG1 and get logged in there. Turns out there's two ways we can implement the read-only domain controller. There is what's called a non-staged implementation. And with this, you physically, as the domain administrator, go out to that branch office, or more likely remote into it, and you, using your credentials, go ahead and set up the read-only domain controller. But a more fun way to go, and what we'll play with in this example, and we're doing it because it's the more complex method, obviously, is we're going to do what's called a staged read-only domain controller. We're going to allow Todd to use his credentials that we set up for him in the domain in order to implement this read-only domain controller, even though this Todd account is not going to have any special privileges whatsoever in our domain. So this is a very cool way to go. So in order to do this stage setup, the first place we're going to go is we're going to go to Active Directory Users and Computers under our Tools menu in Server Manager, and we have this Domain Controllers OU that was created by default for us here. We're going to right-click this, and we're going to choose Pre-Create Read-Only Domain Controller Account in order to stage this thing. Now, before we do that, we better go into the Users container, and we better create this Todd user account. So we're going to go New User inside of the Users folder, and we'll create the Todd Smith account. And the logon name will be T Smith, and we'll choose Next. And then we'll give the password for this user, dropping it in from the clipboard, as we love to do. And we'll say user cannot change password. After we uncheck, user must change password at next login. Password never expires. There we go. We finish. And here we have this user account, Todd Smith. We are not going to grant them any administrator-like privileges in the domain. That's the whole point of this stage setup, isn't it? That this user account, without those powerful privileges, is going to be able to implement this read-only domain controller out at that remote site. Now that we've got that user account created, now we can right-click our Domain Controllers OU and pre-create the read-only domain controller. We'll use the advanced mode of installation here so we can see all the possible options. What account credentials are we actually going to use in the domain to perform the installation? We'll go ahead and use our local administrator account. I shouldn't say local, it's the Nugget Lab domain administrator account. So this Todd Smith credentials are going to reach into our credentials up in the domain for the true permissions. Pretty cool. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to specify the name of the machine that's going to come in and do this. This is going to be our DC-NUG2 system. One thing about this that's critical is this system out there at the remote office can't already be a member of the domain. So if you've got a member server out there that you're going to do this with, you better get it outside of that domain before you do this installation. Go ahead and just pop it into a work group out there at the branch office so this will actually function. The next thing we're going to do is put this in the default site. We haven't talked about Active Directory sites yet, but trust me, we will. And for right now, we're just going to use our default site. Next up, It's going to examine the DNS configuration and get some things ready for us behind the scenes here. Next, it provides us with the options that we're used to in an Active Directory installation, and that is, do we want to install a DNS server out there at the branch office? Do we want a global catalog out there at the branch office? Notice you can actually choose these. And then read-only domain controller, of course, is grayed out because obviously we want one of those out there. That's why we're pre-staging this. So we'll go ahead and give them a local DNS server, good idea, and a global catalog, and choose next. Here we can specify the password replication policy. What's going on here is these really powerful accounts inside the domain, like the administrators group inside our domain, we're going to say, let's not allow the caching of passwords out in the branch office for these accounts. Notice Microsoft comes up with accounts for us by default that we're going to deny the caching of passwords on. So you'd want to, consider this in your overall security policy. What accounts do you not want password caching to occur on out there at the branch office? Oftentimes, we like the default Microsoft config of those super powerful domain-based administrator accounts to never be cached out there at the remote office, to always have to check in for credential checking against the main HQ. So you can manipulate this all you want. For instance, you could come in and say, no, we want to undo this. We want to allow the password caching out there at the branch office for a certain account, and you can manipulate this list. For our purposes, we'll choose next, and notice that we are going to set the user account here or group that's going to be allowed to do this installation out at the remote office. We're going to do a find now in here, and we are going to find our Todd account. Where are you, Todd? There is Todd Smith right there. We'll say OK. We'll say OK again. And there is the account that can perform this installation out at the remote office. We say next. We look at the summary information. We say next. And we finish. And we have just pre-staged the read-only domain controller DC NUG 2. It's now time for us to slide over to the DC NUG 2 machine. Let's do that in our lab controls. You're just going to click on DC NUG 2 and we'll drop in the password to log in over there. And notice what's going on here. We are not part of the domain. Thank goodness. If we were part of the domain, we'd have to rip this machine out in order for this to work. I am in a work group called Branch East. So obviously we're going to be changing that. Something else about this functionality of the staged read-only domain controller, notice I am logged in as the local administrator account. You need administrative privileges on this local machine in order to perform what we're about to perform. All right, so Todd logs in as the local administrator of this machine, and Todd then fires up the server manager. And guess what? He's going to begin an Active Directory installation here. So he goes up to Manage, and he adds roles and features. And in the Add Roles and Features wizard, he chooses Next, he chooses Next, he chooses Next. We're going through this quickly because, of course, you've already done it in this course. He's going to go to Active Directory Domain Services. He adds his features. He chooses Next, he chooses Next, he chooses Next, and he installs Active Directory Services. As you might guess, where the things are going to get really interesting for us is in the second phase where we promote this system to a domain controller. And I'm going to pause the nugget here. We'll be right back to demonstrate that. I love it when things go smoothly, and that first phase went smoothly for us. We're going to click on this promote this server to a domain controller link in order to now promote it to a DC, and we're adding a domain controller to an existing domain this time. And the domain is, of course, nuggetlab.com. What credentials are we going to supply to perform this operation? We are going to be supplying from the Nugget Lab domain the T Smith credentials. Remember, this is a normal run-of-the-mill user account, but it's going to be able to do this thanks to our pre-staging activities. So we'll say OK, and we have the credentials that will be able to perform this, we hope. We're going to choose Next in this wizard. And we are going to get this screen. This is great. It says, okay, do you want to use a pre-staged read-only domain controller account? And that's exactly what we want to do. We want that existing RODC that we set up in the domain. We told it we wanted a domain name server, a global catalog server, and a read-only domain controller in our default site. So all of this is filled out for us. All we need to do is drop in that directory services restore mode password. I'll use that from the clipboard. We're going to say next. We are not installing from media. I'll show you this in an upcoming nugget. We'll choose next. We'll choose the default locations for the database log files in sysvol. We'll choose next. We can see what this would look like scripted, of course, but we are ready to just choose next and install for this awesome read-only domain controller out there at the branch office. So awesome. Now, obviously, we're looking for anything that might be problematic here regarding credentials. We need to make sure that we provisioned up in the domain that Todd Smith user account correctly and did all those steps correctly. Otherwise, we would meet with failure during this installation. And wow, what an incredibly quick install there for the domain controller functionality. As you can see, this system is restarting because we now have a domain controller. Now this system is rebooted, and Todd Smith is not going to have the Nugget Lab administrator credentials to log in. He's going to have to go to the other user and enter his T Smith account information for Nugget Lab. So he does this, and he logs into the system, and inside of Server Manager, he's super excited to manipulate Active Directory. He goes up to Tools, he goes to Active Directory Users and Computers, for instance, and inside of the AD Users and Computers, he goes to the Users container, he right-clicks, he chooses New, and there isn't any new. Of course not. This is a read-only domain controller for his branch office. So fun. Well, we need to wrap up this nugget with a look at our other objective, and that is how we would remove a domain controller. It's so simple. The first thing we're going to need to do is log out as Todd. Todd's going to need our help here, so we're going to remote into this system, and we are going to help Todd perform this. Of course, we are going to log in with someone that would have the rights to do this, and that would be another user, and that would be the administrator. We can drop that in from the clipboard, and that would be the password of the administrator in the Nugget Lab domain. Now we'll be able to have the credentials required in order to remove this domain controller functionality. We're going to go to the Tools menu, actually make that the Manage menu, and instead of Add Roles and Features, we're going to choose Remove Roles and Features. And what we're looking to do is remove everything having to do with Active Directory. So we're going to come in and we're going to clear the Active Directory domain services. We're going to say we want to remove features, and it's quickly going to tell us, look, we need to demote this domain controller before we can remove the Active Directory domain services. So it says, do you have a user account right now that has credentials to do something like this? We're going to say yes. In fact, please force the removal of this domain controller. It says, look, unless this is the absolute last domain controller in the domain, you're going to have to do some metadata cleanup manually after the removal. So we'll say, okay, we understand all that. We'll say that as far as the domain name server goes and the global catalog goes, we understand that these are on this system and that they're going to be removed, and we know that they exist elsewhere in the domain. So we'll say, yeah, to this warning, we're fine. We know that we can provide these services elsewhere, and we'll choose next. We need to provide the new administrator password. We'll go ahead and give that information. And we'll just, again, drop it in from the clipboard. This password, of course, is for the local administrator account that's going to exist on this machine. We choose next, and that's it. We could see the PowerShell that's involved here. Notice the key command is going to be to uninstall the Active Directory Domain Services domain controller. So cool. And we're going to demote this device. Notice it lets us know that the zones that deal with this domain are going to be removed from Active Directory. So any delegations that we have, we should be ready to remove those. The system is now going to reboot as a result of the successful demotion of this device. So we've rebooted. I've logged in as the local administrator, and this is pretty funny. Look at this. We have the exclamation flag here, and it wants us to promote this server to a domain controller. Why is it saying this to us? Well, because we haven't taken care of the second step. We got to go into remove roles and features now, and we need to strip the Active Directory domain services out. So we'll uncheck that. We'll say to remove the tools. And it should allow us to proceed now because we have a demoted system. We'll clear that. We'll say next. We will say next. We will then remove the Active Directory domain services. And this is not going to require a reboot. Just like this install, think about it, the converse side of this, it didn't require a reboot. It was the promotion that did. So in this nugget, you and I took a look at the read-only domain controller. We talked about why we might use one. We discussed how we can do a staged implementation, which you now know how to do step by step, or the very, very simple non-staged, where you would, as the domain administrator, go out there and do the installation yourself, just checking the read-only checkbox upon installation of that domain controller. We also took a look at removing domain controllers from an Active Directory environment. I hope you found this nugget informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.